we use the term in different ways sometimes. But these are about the Bible that have shown us their relationship to God, their relationship to people, and what made them approved of God and acceptable to God. And so that's the point that we're trying to get in each of these lessons, of looking at individuals and saying, you know, that's a trait that I have in my life, or that's a trait that I would like to put into my life. Now, the lessons that are in this series is the one we're going to look at today is David the Shepherd King. Next week we're going to talk about an interesting concept. We're going to talk about a number of different people in the scriptures. Behold, I thought. I know that you have been in that situation in times past in which you thought something was correct on your thinking or your actions, but you found out that you were not right. And so that's what that lesson's about. Then we're going to talk about Joseph, a lesson in forgiveness. And of all people in the scriptures that probably had a good reason for retaliation against his brothers, Joseph would be the one. They sold him into slavery and lied to his father about his death, about him being dead, which he wasn't. And then there's another interesting phase of the life of David in which he takes care of Mephibosheth. Now, I know that's hard to pronounce, but it's a wonderful lesson about caring for other people who have difficulties. Then we're going to talk about Elisha and the Shunammite woman, and how that she was such a gracious individual to a man of God. And then we're going to talk about the obedient son, and that will probably be all of the lessons that I will cover before Joe gets back. Now, I don't know where in the world he is. He's probably sort of like Waldo. You may have to just kind of figure out where in the world is Joe Waldo, Waldo Joe, and that way you might know. And so he will be back the second week in September, and I will continue putting this series together, and the next time that we're together we'll continue with this. We're going to talk about God's pattern Paul. We're going to talk about the captives in Babylon, 4 that we know by name that we will deal with, and their problems and difficulties and how they handle it. The Ethiopian eunuch, the scales of judgment, David again with 5 smooth stones, a tale of 2 apostles. I think you'll find that one interesting later when we get to it. And Noah, a lesson in righteousness. And these are all of the lessons that will be in this particular series. Obviously, that's not all of the people in the Bible that we can learn from. And so there will be later on a second volume and a third volume, and maybe even a 4th volume, depending on how long I live. Okay, today we're going to talk about David, the Shepherd King. One of the interesting things that's found in the scriptures is it begins the story of where we run into David in 1 Samuel 16. And we're going to read all verses 4 through verse 13. Samuel, who was the great prophet and the leader of Israel at this time, did what the Lord commanded, and he came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to him to meet him trembling, and they said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And when they came, he looked upon Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks upon the heart." And then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all of your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but he's out keeping the sheep. Well, let's back up here. And so Samuel said to Jesse, well, send and bring him here, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and he brought him, and now he was ready. And he had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, rise up and anoint him, because this is the one. And Samuel took the horn of oil, he anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. This is kind of a twofold situation. It's, well, threefold. First of all, it's unusual. The elders of the city are scared to death when Samuel shows up. They're afraid they're in trouble. And I don't think they're necessarily think that they're in trouble with Samuel. That hasn't been in my pocket too long. It's sticky. I think that their reaction is that they're afraid God's fixing to rain something down upon them. Samuel's bringing them a bad message. And that's why they say, have you come peaceably? And he said, oh, yes, peaceably. And so he assembles the elders of the city. He gets Jesse and his sons together. And as each one passes by, God signifies to Samuel, that's not the one, this is not the one, this is not the one. And 7 of the sons go by, and Samuel says, well, is there any other sons? Oh, yeah, he's out in the field, he's out taking care of the sheep. He said, well, go call him, and we're not even going to sit down until he gets here. So evidently they send a servant, runs out into the field where David is, and tells him to get back in there real quick. And the servant probably stays with the sheep while David comes back to find out what his dad wants. And so Samuel anoints him. God says, this is the one. And you can just imagine oftentimes as you look upon different scenes, you said, what's he talking about? You know, this can't possibly be the one that we're talking about. How many of you are watching the Olympics? Any of you? Oh, I love the Olympics. I live for the time when the Olympics are on. Back in 2004, when I had my heart attack, I had my bypass surgery in August. And they said, the first thing I said when I woke up was, turn on the television on Channel 9 because that's where the Olympics are. They said they'd never had anybody said that. They had people curse them, say all kinds of strange things, but never turn on the television and want to watch the Olympics. Well, sometimes some of the least likely looking individuals end up winning gold. I watched Saturday, I watched part of the bicycle race. And bicycle racing is like watching grass grow. You know, all it is these guys humped over and just pedaling as hard as they can go. Sometimes there's 100 of them in a group. But there was a breakaway group of 6 that early got way out ahead of everybody else. And the further they got, the less there was in that 6. And finally, in the last part of the last lap, there were 3 that were left and 1 back by himself about 30 seconds behind them. And all 3 of those leaders crashed. They were going too fast downhill, took a curve and hit the curb, and they were all out. And the guy that was in 4th place got the gold medal. And they didn't expect him to get anywhere near the front of the crowd. And it was, I think, the first gold medal that country had ever won. One of those least likely individuals, and David was like that in being chosen to become the new king of Israel. It's interesting to notice that what we do as a child sometimes stays with us even when we become grown, and will also be the object by which we are known. Did you have a buddy that was ever have a buddy that was named Stinky? probably because he didn't take a bath or because of his feet or his shoes. Or you might have somebody, what are some of the favorite childhood names, nicknames that you remember? Do you remember anything special? Maybe you had one. You don't have to tell that was you. But, you know, I got labeled in the 4th grade little professor by my teacher because I was the only kid in the class that wore glasses. It wasn't because I was all that smart, but it was because I looked like a little professor, evidently, to her. Well, she paid the price for that. I had her 2 other times in life. I had her in the 5th grade and then also had her again in high school. David was an interesting young man. He learned to play the lute, which we would call a lyre or a small harp, and he was a shepherd boy. And so he was always known as the shepherd king. David actually had this happen to him. As you saw him as a young child with his harp, here he is as an older man, as the king of Israel, still being able to play on the harp. As a boy, most good Jewish boys were usually sent out to take care of their father's sheep. This was a simple job. It wasn't hard. You didn't have to think much. And if you liked to throw rocks, there was a good time you could sit out and throw rocks all day long as you watched the sheep. I always remember our son when he decided he wanted to play Little League baseball. He was on the Banks team, and he got his uniform, and he looked as professional as anybody. And they put him in the outfield, and he played his own game the whole time. He was throwing balls that weren't out there. He was catching balls that weren't there. And if anybody had hit a ball out there, he'd probably looked at it and said, well, what is this thing? And that's sort of the reason why the young guys were sent out to take care of the sheep. They knew that they couldn't concentrate like everybody else. But David seemed to be kind of different. He was a different person. During this time, he had ended up killing a lion, and also he had, during this particular period of time when he was taking care of the sheep, he had also killed a bear. And I don't know if you ever think about in the Holy Lands that there were bears and lions, but you have to remember how many hundreds of years ago that this was. It's sort of like you go back 200 years in this area right here, and the wildcats and the beasts that were and the bears that were roaming through the woods here in this particular area. And I'm even told that bison even roamed this far south out of the Kentucky area at times. So it's hard for us to conceive of those things, but it's something that he did. And then there were times in which the families were called together and they talked about things. And it was during one of these family work sessions that David was called in to meet the great prophet Samuel. There he is with his brothers, and there he is with his father, and there he is with Samuel the prophet, who's there in the center with the yellow keffiyeh, the headdress that was there. And it was a very odd thing, a very odd thing, because at this time Samuel anoints David to become the king of Israel over the king of Israel who was Saul. So at this particular time, Israel has 2 kings. One officially, one unofficially, but also officially because God has ordained that Samuel anoint David to be the king. Now, he doesn't serve at this time, but it was an opportunity to be known that he was going to be the successor of Saul. Saul, when he finds out about this, doesn't like it. This was because of the background, and it's also of David, and it's also the very way that heroes are made, and this is the way that David became known as the shepherd king of Israel. But it's interesting to notice that David was not only a shepherd, but he was also a poet, and he was also a songwriter. Now, when you're out keeping sheep and you run out of rocks to throw, what else is there to do? Well, if you got a knife, you can whittle on a stick. And if you whittle up all the sticks and you get tired of that, you start making up things in your mind, and you write poetry and you write songs, and usually songs are mostly poetry that have been put to music anyway. And so this was an opportunity that shepherding gave a person time to use their minds and to create things. And here would be David, that he was with the sheep and thinking very, very seriously about some of the things that he's going to write down. And it's kind of interesting that David is noted for having written many of the Psalms which are recorded in the Bible, and they were put to music. And possibly one of the reasons why David was noted as the shepherd king is because of the 23rd Psalm. If you'd like, you can read this with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Just got an update from Judy at the hospital. She says she's going to stay there. He's right down to only breathing about 12 breaths a minute, so evidently his time is very short right now. So if you don't mind, we'd appreciate your prayers for the family. Heroes are usually made from some truth and some exaggeration. What do you remember about the song about Daniel Boone? Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, killed him a bar when he was only 3. Do you really believe that he killed a bear when he was 3 years old? No, but it rhymes. And it makes a hero. You see, some truth and some exaggeration all brings together. And you remember Davy Crockett? Where was it? Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier, born on a mountaintop in Tennessee. You know, Davy Crockett was not born on a mountaintop. He's born on a flat place over next to a river. How many of you ever been up to, Jonesboro? That's where he's from. If you haven't ever been in, you need to go up there and see that place. It's interesting because it helps you to understand that our heroes are made from some truth and some exaggeration, and sometimes a lot of exaggerations. David became a household name because he did kill the giant Goliath in battle. Now, it's an interesting story just by itself, and later on we'll deal with this particularly in the lesson called Five Smooth Stones. But here he goes out. Nobody's willing to take on this great giant. The giant every day comes out and challenges the army of Israel and said, well, just send somebody out to fight me. Well, when you're 9 feet tall, that's a pretty stout individual. I'm 6 foot, and that means he's half again as tall as I. That's a big dude. And he's got this huge sword. He's got this huge shield. He's got this huge spear. And nobody wants to go out and fight him. And David says, I'll take him on. He goes out and takes his slingshot, and whap, he hits him right between the eyes with a rock and knocks him down and jerks out his sword and cuts off his head. Well, he's not going to get up from that. And as a result of this, the armies of the Philistines are shocked And the armies of the Israelites are elated, and they shout, and they chase the Philistines all the way back home. And so David becomes a hero. And all of the elements of this strange event tend to give a slightly more than human view of a little boy. He's more than a little boy. He's probably in his late teens that killed this huge giant and threatened the children of God. Regardless of how yicky the slicing of the head off the head of the giant would be, that would have been an interesting time to have been there, at least in the army of the Israelites, and see all of this happen, and this big giant hits the ground, and David jumps up and chops off his head. Well, you can just remember all the hype and all of the songs then that were sung about David. One of those is found in 1 Samuel 18:7. The women sang to one another as they made merry, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Do you think David ever killed 10,000 people? Nah, I don't either. Heroes are made out of some fact and a lot of exaggeration sometimes. And Saul was very angry for this saying displeased him. It says, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. What more can he have except the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. It caused problems for David because of these great songs that were made about him. Not only was he a hero, but he also became the enemy of King Saul through Saul's jealousy over the sudden popularity that David received from the people. David also became popular with the people because of his simple background. I guess one of the best illustrations of all of this was a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln has become, or was, one of America's most popular presidents, not necessarily during the time in which he lived and served as president, but has been one of those reference points that everybody goes back to and said, you know, what a great president that this man was. And surely he's not a very handsome looking man, very skinny, very ruddy looking facial features, huge ears, I guess the better to hear you with, as the little children's verse goes. And the thing that made this unhandsome man from Illinois so popular was that he was born in a log cabin. And there's the cabin that he was born in. He did study his lessons by the fireside. And he did do his math on the shovel with the charcoal stick. And he did split rails for a living until he was able to attend law school and became a lawyer. And from things that I read, was not one of the most successful lawyers for a long period of time. This type of down-home boy that made such a great president was the one thing that made David popular with his subjects. He was a shepherd boy. He was from Bethlehem, which was not one of the greatest of all of the cities of Israel. You see, David was a very simple shepherd boy, but he did kill the bear, and he did kill the lion in protection of his father's sheep. He did kill the giant, Goliath, and he put the army of the Philistines to rout, and he was chased all over the countryside later on by King Saul, who was trying to kill him for no apparent reason except for jealousy, and he was close to his men as he developed his army. Now, you separate the fact from the fiction, and you really begin to see who David really is. And there was another thing that made David very popular to his people, and this was his open feelings. They knew what was making him happy and sad. You remember the sad story about David and his transgression with Bathsheba? After Uriah was put to death on the war field, David took Bathsheba to be his wife, and she conceived a child. And God told Nathan to tell David that that child was going to die. And this was part of his punishment for his transgression of murder of Uriah, and also for adultery with Bathsheba. So when David was mourning over the death of this child that was born to Bathsheba, his whole house knew about his suffering and his sadness. And so when the child died, David has a change of countenance after the death of this child. He arose after the death of the child, and the household servants were puzzled by the sudden change in his countenance and the sudden change in his open countenance. And Samuel, in the book of Samuel, David gives an account of what took place and what happened. David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "Now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went to his house. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of his house stood beside him, urging him to get up from the ground, but he would not. And he would not eat food with them. And on the seventh day the child died. The servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, "While the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we tell him that the child is dead? He may do himself more harm." These people were afraid of the openness that David was showing to them. They were afraid to tell him that the child is dead because of the grieving that he had done while the child was still alive. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, he perceived that the child was dead, and David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" They said, "He's dead." Then David rose from the ground. He washed himself. He anointed himself. He changed his clothes. He went to the house of the Lord. He worshiped. Then he went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. His servant said, "What is this that you've done? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, and when the child died, you rose and ate food." They say, "This is backwards from what people usually do." David said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live. But now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." Interesting to see the character of David in all of this. Of one of the first things that he does when the child dies, he washes, he changes his clothes, he goes to the house of the Lord and he worships God, then he goes to eat. Interesting. This is a man that was after God's own heart. David was openly repentant over his sin with Bathsheba, and the people knew how he felt because he wrote a song about his grief and his sin. And this comes from Psalms 51. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in an inward being, and therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Do not take your Holy Spirit from me." Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit. And then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. David was called a man after God's own heart. Well, let's read these last three verses here from Psalms 51. He says, "For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give you a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken, contrite heart. O God, you will not despise this. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings, and bulls will be offered upon your altar." David was called a man after God's own heart. In 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14, this statement is said to Saul by Samuel. The story goes back is that Saul has gone down and defeated the enemies. He was supposed to wait till Samuel got there so that Samuel would offer sacrifice. Saul got tired of waiting. He goes down. He defeats all the army. And he was told he was to kill all the men, the women, the children, and their animals. And on the way back, he's bringing back the best of the animals. And he meets Samuel on the road. And Samuel says, "What is this that you've done?" Saul says, "I did what the Lord wanted me to do, what you told me to do." And he says, "Well, what is this that I hear the lowing of these animals?" He said, "Well, the people wanted to do this." Good. Charity begins at home. Very good point. And in all of this, this is the point in which Saul is officially notified that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him. He says, "Now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people because you, Saul, have not kept what the Lord commanded you to do." That's pretty tough stuff. And then finally we find that David was a man that was unusually close to God. Notice the writing in Psalms 139. This helps us to understand how much of David's life that God knows about. You think about this and think about your life and how much God knows about you. "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I get up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go away from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. Deliver me, O Lord, from evil." And the second of these that we look at is Psalms 140. This shows the trust that David has in God's direction for his life and for his protection from his enemies. Psalms 139, he talks about there is no place that he can hide from God. In Psalms 140, he talks about how much he trusts God. Deliver me, O Lord, from evildoers. Protect me from those that are violent, who plan evil things in their minds and stir up wars continually. They make their tongue sharp as a snake's, and under their lips is the venom of vipers. Selah. Guard me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Protect me from the violent who have planned my downfall. The arrogant have hidden a trap for me. When with cords they have spread a net along the road. They have set snares for me. Selah. And I say to the Lord, you are my God. Give ear, O Lord, to the voice of my supplications. O Lord, my strong deliverer, you have covered my head in the day of battle. And then we also find when David was down and out, he knew who he needed to turn to, who would help him get back to a normal life. And it was God and God alone. And this is what he says in Psalms 142. Notice that each of these are succeeding psalms that follow each other. With my voice, I cry to the Lord. With my voice, I make supplication to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. And when my spirit is faint, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they've hidden a trap for me. Look on my right hand and see, there is no one that takes notice of me. No refuge remains for me. Nobody cares for me. You can almost add into this, going out to the garden to eat worms. Not quite, but pretty close to it. I cry to you, O Lord, and I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Save me from my persecutors, for they're too strong for me. Bring me out of prison so that I can give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you deal bountifully with me. David was a remarkable person who learned very early in his life to trust God for protection and for deliverance from evil. David was one who was very easily touched by his own sins. He repented from them, and he always appealed to God for forgiveness and for restoring to his former relationship with God. And David, in all of this hero worship by the people, still came across as a normal man who committed sin and had to repent of those sins. David served as king of Israel for 40 years. He was the second king of Israel and probably the most remembered and most beloved of the united kings of Israel. We need to have the same repentant attitude that David had toward sin and in restoring our relationship to God. Our next lesson in this series is going to be, Behold, I Thought. Thank you for being so kind and listening today, and I hope that this lesson has been beneficial to you. We'll be dismissed for about 15 minutes.